Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. In this program, we discuss a range of issues. The platform for this program is the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is a policy research center housed in the University of Lahore and researches contemporary security and strategic issues. This program is part of that effort, and we aim to speak with national and international scholars and policy experts on a broad range of issues that have a bearing on Pakistan. So stay with us, and we will shortly bring you today's discussion. Welcome back to InFocus. Our first topic today is the ongoing Russo-Ukraine war, which is poised to enter another phase. Russian forces have faced setbacks in the northeast, that's the Kharkiv region, east, where Ukraine now controls Salman, and south, where in the Kherson Oblast, Ukrainian counteroffensives have cleared some territory west of Dnipro, have targeted important nodes in the Russian supply lines, putting pressure on nearly 30,000 Russian troops deployed there. President Vladimir Putin, on his part, has decided to strike deep into Ukrainian territory with long-range cruise missiles and direct attack munitions like the upgraded Iranian Shahed 136 drones to target and degrade critical infrastructure. Additionally, he holds another card, gas supplies. Last month, he threatened to cut off energy supplies if price caps are imposed on Russian oil and gas exports, warning the West it would be frozen like a wolf's tail, referring to a Russian fairy tale in which a sly fox lets a wolf's tail freeze. In other words, a clash of arms is not about to end. Can it end? When can it end? Ukraine wants to throw Russia out of its territories. That's Kyiv's irreducible minimum. For Putin, the absolute minimum in theory is for Kyiv to accept what Russia has captured and now physically possesses. Let's see what our experts say. I have with me Dr.Hein Goemans. Dr. Goemans is a professor of political science at the University of Rochester in New York. He's the author of War and Punishment, The Causes of War Termination, and the First World War. The book, published in 2000, is widely regarded as the work that induced other scholars to study how, when, and why wars end. With him is Dr. Branislav Slantchev. Professor Slantchev teaches at the University of California in San Diego and studies military coercion, intrawar negotiations, the conduct of war, and war termination. He is the author of Military Threats, The Costs of Coercion, and The Price of Peace. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the program. Let me begin with Professor Goemans here. Professor Goemans, from what it seems on the ground, like, if I refer back to the model that you used in the book that I talked about in my opening, the three factors, namely information, domestic politics, and credible commitment, all three seem to remain unresolved in this case, which essentially means, going by your model, that the war is unlikely to end at this point. So give me your sense of where you think the things are headed.
Thank you, Howard. This was a very good introduction to the overall topic of what's going on at the moment and to my way of thinking about how wars end. Let me start by giving you an example from the First World War, which has some surprising analogies with the current war. In 1916, there was the very, very famous Battle of Verdun in France, where the Germans attacked Verdun, the whole line. And you might have thought, as many people do, that the purpose of the Germans was to defeat the French army. But it was explicit in Falkenhayn's plans, the chief of the general staff of the Germans at that time, that was not the goal. The goal was to show the French the cost of war. The goal was to bleed the French white. So the new information that was to be provided to the French at that time was information about how costly the war will be. As your scenario or your summary of the current state of affairs laid out earlier on, it seems to me that this is partially what's going on at the moment, that Putin is trying to tell the Ukrainians the costs of war are going to be too high. We're going to take out your energy infrastructure, we're going to kill civilians, and thereby force the Ukrainians to revise their minimum terms of settlement. It deserves note, as Professor Slantchev has also noticed, that this strategy to impose higher and higher costs to force the other side to lower claims has never worked.
Right. Since you talked about the First World War, there's also the issue of commitment. For instance, in 1917, Germany did not negotiate for peace, and perhaps not because of domestic compulsions, but more because without annexing Belgium, they thought that the threat of Britain and France was too severe for Germany. So do you think that is also something in terms of, for instance, for Putin to think that Ukraine can, at any level, defeat Russia in a conventional war means Putin's own end, and also a severe setback to Russia as in terms of its world position as a power?
Well, there is an interesting thing going on at the moment with the Ukrainians in this perspective. I would say that Ukraine has credibly limited aims. I do not think that the Ukrainians aim to gain a single inch of Russian territory. So Ukraine can commit to a deal and stick to it. I mean, a deal that would actually give it back its 1991 borders. Whether the current government can credibly commit to make a deal that leaves Russia with large gains is highly, highly questionable, it seems to me. But from an international politics perspective, Russia cannot make any promises that will be trusted. Russia cannot credibly commit to make a deal because in the future it will renege. It has done so in Georgia. It keeps doing so in Georgia, where it moves the borders every time a little bit farther into Georgia proper. It's done so in Ukraine. It's done elsewhere. And that, of course, makes it very difficult. It makes it impossible to accept any terms of settlement that leave Russia with the gains and a possibility to come for our next round. Unless, that is, there is a credible guarantor that would guarantee that deal. The question is, who would that be?
Absolutely. And that point basically is something that you have written in detail about in your book. Professor Slantchev, if I may pull you in now, what do you think? There is a huge gap between what Kyiv wants, which is essentially, as Professor Goemans said, going back to the 1991 borders, and for Putin, the irreducible minimum would be, in case of, or in theory, any kind of international guarantees or negotiations, to at the minimum retain what they physically possess today. So it seems that right now there is not much space for bargaining.
Yes. So we can discuss what I think Ukrainians say and what they really can credibly demand or expect to gain. But let me just add, to set this up a little bit, let me just add that I actually think that informational problems are still driving this conflict, because it is my impression that Putin and the people around him seem to believe that they can still win by conventional military force, the territory that they want. And it is not limited to just, Donbass. They clearly have designs on the south of Ukraine, going out to Kharkiv, to Odessa, and to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. That has been their desire from the beginning. This is why the annexations are happening where they are. And so I'm not even sure his minimal claims right now would be to just hold the territory. The massive mobilization, yes, people kind of tend to dismiss it a little bit, I think, because it is so chaotic and so badly done. But it is bringing tens and tens of thousands of people to the front, and they are slowing down the Ukrainians. That's a huge problem. And so I think the Russians still believe that they can actually prevail in this. And this is pushing them further away from negotiations. They have absolutely no interest in anything but surrender to these terms. That is why they're trying to drag, or at least threaten to drag, Belarus into this. Of course, now with Iran getting into this with supplies, is giving them a new lease on life, essentially. They seem to have been running down their stocks of missiles, but now even ballistic missiles might be coming from Iran. And so the gap is vast. Now, the Ukrainians also revised their aims upwards, actually. At the beginning of the war, they seemed to want to negotiate on terms that would have left the Russians in possession essentially of the territories they had occupied before the invasion. And now this seems to no longer be the case. Now they're talking Crimea is back, Donbass is back, all this stuff. I'm not so sure that this is a non-negotiable position, frankly, to tell you the truth, because in Luhansk, in Donetsk, in Crimea, the Russians have had a lot of time to prepare all sorts of defenses, and it's been very costly to actually take by force. And so I think it is reasonable to suppose that for the Ukrainians, as soon as they come out on the February 2022 line of contact, they may be willing to start negotiations. Now, this is not to say that they're going to agree to leave these territories in Russia, right? But they may be willing to start negotiations. I, in particular, am very worried about anything that unconditionally demands the return of Crimea, for instance, to Ukraine, just because it has such a high mobilization potential in Russia to resist that I don't see, even if Putin goes, what Russian government, unless it's fallen apart, essentially, would agree to this. And so that could prolong the war.
That's a very interesting point with reference to the point of contact on 24th February. But if, in theory, if the Ukrainians were to at some point say, okay, this is something that can be negotiated, it seems to me that perhaps we would then be preparing the grounds for another round of armed clash. It's almost like the Azerbaijan-Armenia thing back in 1994, and then, it took the Azeris so many years to actually start a war and reclaim many of those territories. But let me assail this issue from another angle. Let's go back to 24th Feb, and we see a two-pronged southward advance of Russian military from the Belarus territory. It was aimed at Kyiv. That was the main war effort at that time, and it seemed that the objective was to take Kyiv, to install a quote-unquote friendly government, and then to negotiate with the West, assuming that the taking of Kyiv is going to essentially strike a blow to the Ukrainian will to fight. That did not happen. That operation could not be sustained for a number of reasons. Do you think that that sort of gives us an indication that perhaps Putin has downgraded the objectives, the war objectives, and is now going to focus, as is clear on the ground, in the northeast, east, and south?
I don't think Putin has downgraded his objectives. I think his aim is to topple the government if he can. We only think of the main strike being on Kiev at the time simply because the rest fell with so much resistance. But, I mean, they occupied tremendous territories in the east and in the south as well. Given that the Russians are now and the Belarusians are preparing a joint army group in Belarus, which even the Belarusians say it should be around 90,000. This is double their army size. Basically, Belarus is going to become part of Russia at this point.
Right.
But internal sources suggest it may be as big as 120,000 by the spring. It tells me that by the spring, they may have some designs to renew an attack actually on Kyiv. Right. And so I do not think he's basically, yes, he's receded from his demands because back in, I believe it was April, the military came out with this press conference where they suddenly announced that the main objective is to hold Donbass, which took everybody by surprise at the time, and kind of forced his hand, I think, somehow to withdraw, because they convinced him, I think, that they cannot do this right now. But whether he's decided from this that he cannot do it at all is an open question. And I don't think, looking at what he's actually doing, I think is up to his old kind of designs.
Right. That's interesting. Professor Goemans, let's move a little away from the battlefields to the European countries and the gas supplies and what Russia can do. And of course, the fact that, we see, for instance, Viktor Orban in Hungary, he's had a run-in with the European Union and said, look, we need to do something about these sanctions because we do need energy supplies from Russia. Italy is now governed by a right-wing government, Giorgia Meloni there. And then the Romanian defense minister, Vasily Dinko, he resigned. And he said that, and he basically resigned because he said that we need to negotiate with Russia. So as the very cold winter sets in, there is the problem of public opinion. I mean, there have been demonstrations in Czechia and also in France. Is that something that Putin is also relying on? Because as the war drags on and as he essentially implements the threat that he made in September, which was last month, that's going to have an impact on the unity of European Union / European NATO countries in terms of how they look at this war?
Well, Putin certainly hopes so, right? By the way, it's also in Eastern Germany. This is why the Germans are a little bit tentative about everything. Yeah. But in Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands, and you may not know that the largest natural gas field in the world used to be in Slochten, which is in the north of the Netherlands. And there was a lot of protests, local protests against exploitation of this field because it led to small earthquakes and the soil subsided, so houses fell and stuff like that and cracked. And there was an enormous amount of local opposition to exploitation. And therefore, exploitation of the whole fields was going to be shut down. There was a survey done in late March, early April, I believe, in the Netherlands. That an overwhelming majority of Dutch people and locals agreed to renew exploitation of those gas fields. This is a massive shift in local Dutch opinion. It doesn't get much attention anywhere else. But it seems to me that this is a good indication of how strong public opinion in the Netherlands, but it's important with the gas that we have, how strong public opinion is behind Ukraine and how it sees the war for what it is. So, yes, Putin and other people like to play up concerns about gas and scare people. But I do believe, and I hope, I'm a little bit more optimistic perhaps than Professor Slantchev on this, that public opinion is indeed solidly behind Ukraine and willing to continue supporting it even in a cold winter.
Okay. Now, here's the thing. In Astana, very recently, Putin met with President Erdogan of Turkey, and they talked about Turk Stream and making Turkey a hub for supply of gas to, as President Putin put it, to anyone interested in Europe. So he's, on the one hand, threatening to do something, which is the stick, and also dangling a carrot. Doesn't that come across as a smart strategy?
Yeah, is that a carrot, or is that the fact that he needs to make money on the sale of gas?
It's a quid pro quo. so yeah, he makes money, and Europe gets the gas.
I mean, where else can he sell it? I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, of course, he can sell it to China. So, but he needs to make money to actually finance this war and keep some semblance of an economy. I don't think there's any graciousness or generosity on the part of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin here.
No, absolutely not. I mean, interstate relations are all about Macht and realpolitik. I mean, it's got nothing to do with generosity at all. But let me go to Professor...
as I know you know.
Yeah, let me go to Professor Slantchev.
Of course I know that, yes.
Professor Slantchev, there's also, as you know, in the past month or so, there's been a lot of discussion and analyses about Putin's kind of implied threat of the use of a nuclear weapon, perhaps a tactical nuclear weapon. Is that something you think is credible?
Well, that is the $6 million question. I mean, if it's credible. I think, if you ask me if he's capable of doing it, I think yes, absolutely. I think people also want to speculate would these orders be carried out. I think there's a good chance that they wouldn't, but we cannot assume this, so we have to act as if they would. I was much more worried about this, frankly, before the mobilization began. So I'm the only one who's kind of welcomed this idea of mobilization, because to me it seems he's decided to try a conventional military solution to the problem. Mm-hmm. Because frankly, the military aspect of the use of a nuclear weapon, operational, tactical, eludes me. I mean, aside from scaring people, it's not going to have actually an impact on the military operations themselves. And so what is he going to do if he blows up something, right?
Right.
There's going to be some response from NATO. And then what? And so my biggest fear is that the Russians may be severely underestimating the Western resolve to respond to this. And I think we will. But the way they talk, it seems that they doubt it. And this is the only reason, if they think this is the exploding something like this could tip the scales finally and break off Western support for Ukraine, they may actually do this. Now, they absolutely need to try to break the Western support if they have any chance of winning. And frankly, I mean, Ukraine is in trouble. Without us, its economy is already down by a third, the GDP. I mean, they actually haven't done any serious macroeconomic adjustment to this. So I'm a little worried what they're doing there, but they're relying on us. They're relying on financial injections to keep things going, to keep the inflation kind of down as much as they can. But of course, they will need to be doing a whole lot more. So the thinking is, I guess, in the Kremlin, that if they break the Western unity, and they actually have good hopes of, in some case, of this working out. You mentioned Hungary. In general, I think the gas blackmail is gone. It's not going to work. The European Commission just announced that, Europe is mostly now free on average from the Russian supplies. There were 40% of gas came from Russia. Now it's down to 7%. That's a tremendous reduction in just 6 months, essentially. But of course, you have places like Austria and Hungary that are very dependent on this, and Slovakia for that matter. And so that's an issue. And I think this is part of the reason you now see these noises from the US and retired generals, making these claims that the response doesn't have to be a NATO response. It may be a US-led coalition response, because there's, I think, some fear that we got some Trojan horses there in NATO as well, who may not approve the proper response. So all of this is kind of jockeying right now to just warn the Russians to not underestimate, I think, American resolve. And this is why we just sent almost 6,000 troops, for training exercises on the border with Ukraine and Romania. I think it's all part of it.
Okay. So let me get Professor Goemans. Sure. Professor
Can I jump in for a moment?
Yeah, sure. But can I just sort of add a follow-up to what Professor Slantchev is saying? In terms of, so you use a tactical nuclear weapon. It doesn't really have much military value, but it has a huge psychological value. I mean, whether it's Moldova, whether it's Poland, whether it's Estonia, Lithuania, it has a certain kind of psychological impact. And perhaps if Putin were to begin to game it, this is one of the factors that he will obviously factor in.
So let me return to something that Professor Slantchev said a while ago, that he thinks that the continuation of the war is still largely driven by informational problems. I largely agree, but there is also domestic politics. I do think that Putin has to be wary about coming home with less than a victory, or less, something that is worth less than the cost of the war. And from that perspective, the use of nuclear weapons, allows you perhaps a slightly different take. That it's not so much to use on the battlefield, that it's just used to scare the Europeans. And the nuclear weapon doesn't even have to be deployed on the battlefield. It can do a test of a radical new missile, and the Germans are going to be scared out of their wits. And his hope may well be to use that to force the Europeans to pressure the Ukrainians to give terms of settlement that he can accept.
Right. So that's interesting. So you agree with me that it has a massive psychological impact?
Yes, I could. I mean, particularly in Germany and other countries. But I do agree. So here's the point, right? This is classic deterrence by denial.
Correct.
So the idea is, in order to prevent this from happening, the Europeans have to signal loud and very, very loud and clearly that the use of nuclear weapons, even for demonstration purposes will not make the Europeans put pressure on the Ukrainians to make a deal that is acceptable to Putin. Because if that promise not to put pressure on the Ukrainians is credible, then Putin's whole reason for using nukes in the first place goes out the door. So, right, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah? Don't use it because it won't work.
Okay. Professor Slantchev.
Yeah, I actually also think I would like to reinforce this and say that I think Putin's entire strategy here, which seems to be targeting, the kind of putting pressure on civilians in Europe and in Ukraine. Everybody agrees that the Ukrainians are not going to cave into this. But I also think this is also overestimating the influence that public opinion has on foreign policy, even in democracies, frankly. I mean, even if people start, wavering a little, and there's no sign that they are. In fact, support for Ukraine has increased both in Europe and in the US over the past months because of obviously the battlefield success that Ukrainians have had that kind of has encouraged people to think that they may actually do this. So even if public support wavers, that does not mean that the political elites will. And I think, at least in the US, there seems to be a pretty strong consensus now that it's in American interest not to yield on this. And so I think this entire strategy, and maybe they're realizing this, I actually think, despite the recent demarche by Shoigu with the dirty bomb that he did, that I have not seen this, ratcheting up of the rhetoric. They're now talking more about, let's, do the winter thing, let's see how they freeze and things like this, which is prolong, extend, so they can train these mobilized people, the masses that they want to throw into this. And so I think maybe they also realize that this is not going to work. I mean, last time the Soviets tried this in West Berlin, it backfired very badly when they tried to freeze them and starve them. They turned on the communists, essentially.
Well, there's much to talk about, but I'm also getting to the end of the segment. But quickly, Professor Goemans, right now on both sides, clearly the expected utility for fighting is higher than that of settlement. So give me your prognosis. I know, one should not ask for predictive sort of assessments, but given your experience and the book that you've written, when do you think a space for settlement is likely to open up, and under what circumstances?
Years, unfortunately. It's difficult to see. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people more are going to die. And how this war comes to an end is difficult to foresee. The best case scenario is that Putin gets removed by some kind of democratically inclined leader who puts in place a parliament which can hold him to account, whereby supposedly Russia can credibly commit not to raise its demands in the future, because there would be a leader who did such a thing would be punished or removed by parliament. But that is so far-fetched that I don't think it's going to be possible in this case.
Just to
alternative,
just to intervene on the basis of what you're saying, that going by your own model, if he feels that that's a likelihood, then he is going to gamble for resurrection. So that only prolongs the war rather than terminating it.
Exactly. So here's the other side. I wanted to have two sides of the coin on Russia. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that he becomes an utter dictator, like Saddam Hussein, who lost the war in the Gulf War in 1991, but basically completely killed and eradicated the two rebellions in the south and in the north. If he's able to do that, then he can perhaps settle on losing terms. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? I mean, in order for this war to end, more Russians may have to die, at the hand of Putin himself. It's a horrible situation.
It's a horrible situation. Professor Slantchev, quickly, your view, and then I'll close this.
I think there is basically no chance of a peace settlement with Putin in power. I am very doubtful that there might be one that's permanent in the way that Hein describes it, Professor Goemans describes it, even with the successive government, because I do not see in the Russian elites. I see that they do not maybe want to fight in Ukraine right now, but not that acknowledgement that Ukraine, has a right to exist as such. So the only stable peace there would be with very strong security guarantees. I basically believe unless Ukraine gets into NATO, it's not going to be possible. And I think that as far as the Russian side is concerned, the government that made the war will not be the government who makes the peace.
That's very interesting. I suspect, and once again, I don't like to say this, but given the situation on the ground, I think we will have, unfortunately, more occasion to talk about this. But for now, thank you so much, Professor Hein Goemans, Professor Branislav Slantchev, for being on the program. Our second topic of discussion is the firestorm of criticism faced by Saudi Arabia from the United States after a decision by OPEC Plus to cut down oil production by 2 million barrels per day. This is the deepest cut to oil production since the coronavirus pandemic. OPEC Plus is the biggest global cartel of oil producing countries and comprises 13 members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and 11 other non-OPEC members. The decision to curb supply puts pressure on an already tight oil market. Market observers say the move will push up petrol prices for US consumers ahead of midterm elections next month, which are crucial for Democrats and the US President Joe Biden. Key Democratic Party lawmakers have gone to the extent of calling for fundamentally reassessing the US-Saudi partnership. Some have asked for ending security cooperation with the kingdom. Biden has said the kingdom will face consequences over this decision. The question for us is whether this is another bump in the road or does it indicate a trend or trajectory, if you will, of gradually weakening US-Saudi relations. A partnership that goes back to 1933 when full diplomatic relations were established and became formalized in the 1951 Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement. I'm joined by Dr. David Ottaway, currently at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ottaway is author most recently of Mohammed bin Salman, the Icarus of Saudi Arabia. He worked 35 years for the Washington Post as a foreign correspondent in the Middle East, Africa, and Southern Europe, and brings vast experience of the complexity that informs the MENA region. With him is Abdul Aziz Al-Ghashian. Dr. Al-Ghashian earned his PhD from the University of Essex, where he taught international relations and politics and Middle Eastern studies for several years. Currently, his research focuses on Saudi policy towards Israel and more broadly Arab-Israeli relations. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on the program. Let me begin with Dr. Ottaway. Dr. Ottaway, what is your prognosis? I mean, we do know that President Biden wasn't particularly enamored of Mohammed bin Salman, especially after the Khashoggi incident. But very recently, he came over to Saudi Arabia and tried to reset relations. And now it seems that, it's been a snakes and ladder thing. And, we're back to square one of sorts. Is that impression correct, or is there more complexity to this?
Well, from my viewpoint of dealing with Saudi Arabia and U.S.-Saudi relations since the 70s, my feeling is we've been on a downward trend really ever since 9/11, the attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda. And we had a reset after that experience in 2005 when Bush met with Crown Prince Abdullah, and we've kind of revived our relationship. But I think what strikes me most in the current situation is that we do not have a common cause to bring us together. We have causes that have been dividing us. For the Saudis, it's been, Yemen, it's been the behavior of Qatar, and the growing U.S. oil power, because we are now an exporter, and we are currently the number one oil producer. So from the Saudi point of view, this is these are all the issues for the Saudis. For us, the common cause for a long time, well, first the Cold War. And really since the end of the Cold War, we've been struggling to find what our common cause is to bring us together. Certainly, the fight against Al-Qaeda and counterterrorism brought us together, but that's kind of faded as an issue. the oil issue, we're at odds because we're exporting and challenging the supremacy of Saudi Arabia as the oil bank of the central bank of the oil world. So, and then we had the Khashoggi incident. So really, for me, the relationship has been going downward ever since 9/11. 9/11 being the September 11, 2001 attacks on Al Qaeda attacks on the United States.
Right. So let me ask you this: do you think that there is not much there for this relationship to be reset or at least brought to an even keel? I mean, what about Iran? What about the Saudi role in at least the Arab League, if not entirely the Muslim world? The issue of Israel, that's a question that I'll take to Dr. Al-Ghachian also. But give me a sense, are you saying that there's really nothing there to bind the two together?
The only thing binding us together right now is American arms sales.
Okay.
To Saudi Arabia, which is a huge figure. I mean,
that's right.
We have been the number one exporter of arms to Saudi Arabia for decades, but really recently, very substantial amount of arms have been flown, U.S. arms to Saudi Arabia. Iran, on the other hand, is a very issue that divides us, doesn't bring us. It's not a common cause.
Okay.
And so even though we're both the United States and Saudi Arabia see Iran as a real problem, they see it as more a problem than we do. And you can see that reflected in starting with Obama when he worked out the agreement with the Iranians on the nuclear limitations for Iran, and the Saudis were always very nervous about this because
just like the Israelis, the Saudi position. Well, I agree with you. Is closer to Tel Aviv's position rather than Washington D.C.'s.
Yeah.
Well, counting out former President Trump's presidency, which actually brings me to what some of the Democrats have said, that these oil cuts are meant to increase pressure in the upcoming midterm elections, and if the Republicans make a comeback, then that's going to be one step closer to the Republican presidency in the next presidential elections. And then, of course, there's a Russia factor also. Is that something which is making the current administration feel the way it does, and which is reflected in what President Biden said?
There's no doubt about it that President Biden went to Saudi Arabia hoping to patch up his personal relations with Mohammed bin Salman. As you probably recall, he had called the crown prince the pariah of the world, and they deserved it. And so their personal relationships were terrible.
Correct.
So that was one reason he went there. Second reason was to ask him to produce more oil, so it would bring down the gasoline prices in the United States. And the third issue, which is complicated, as I've said, is Iran. Now, if there is no nuclear agreement with Iran, bringing the United States and Iran back into the agreement they worked out earlier, then the question is Iran going to go for nuclear weapons? And if it does, the United States and Saudi Arabia may find a very important common cause, and we will need them as partners in any kind of military option against Iran.
So one can't factor that out. But let me go to Dr. Al-Ghachian on this. Dr. Al-Ghachian, you heard Dr. Ottaway. do you agree with him that there's not much to bind the US and the kingdom together? And of course, he's now said that if there is no deal with Iran, and if Iran were to move towards, in theory, towards getting nuclear weapons, then of course, once again, Riyadh will become very important. So give me your view of how you look at this situation.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. I think that, I mean, it would be fruitful to start off with just a few words on the nature of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. I think one of the misunderstandings, I think, or the things that are being very much overlooked throughout kind of the analytical, through the analysis globally and the scholarship, is at times, it is assumed that the Saudi-American relationship has always been hunky-dory and everything's been fantastic and there's been no turbulence. Quite frankly, this is on the complete contrary. Ever since the conception of this relationship, there has been turbulence. And while Dr. Ottaway was right to say that 9/11 was a problem, 1973 was a problem, what we have seen, though, is that notwithstanding these turbulences throughout the Saudi-American history, it seems to me that there has been some sort of mechanism, some sort of juncture where they recalibrate the relationship again, and they end up reminding themselves of the necessity of the strategic relationship. And your question, and what I actually appreciate about your question that you posed to Dr. Ottaway, is that, well, what about the Arab League? Is Saudi's role in the Arab League and Saudi role? And I think if we've seen the Trump administration, and we've seen even the last visit that happened in Jeddah to collect, join leaders, and so it has its fair share of agency in the region, which I don't think the United States will want to forgo. So while there's always been turbulence, there's also been some sort of self-correcting mechanism within this relationship that make and remind both countries of their relations. Now, what we are seeing now, the only thing that I think is probably different than what happened historically, is I think the level of symbolism is absent. I think the level of discourse is absent. And I think that, so for example, just before I go into why, for example, so before, I would say both states and respective governments of the times used to, invest some sort of effort in showing the friendship aspect of it, the banality aspect of the relationship. And I think now, there is a sort of audience that kind of likes to see this realistic side of the Saudi-American relationship, not the symbolic side of the Saudi-American relationship. And so it plays to each other's audiences, but notwithstanding the strategic relationship that takes place. So I personally see this discursive, symbolic turbulence take place. I don't see a divorce of the relationship taking place.
Right.
Soon.
I understand that. That's a point that's also been made by people within the US who say that the kingdom is far too important for a number of reasons for the US and Saudi Arabia to have a divorce. But very quickly, because I'm reaching the end of the segment, do you think that there's a bit of a paradox or irony, if you will, that on the one hand, it seems that a lot of what has happened recently, and you're right, we are not going into history, there has been turbulence in history, but I'm talking about the last 2-3 years, that Saudi Arabia has made some strides in terms of reforming its economy, in terms of reforming its social relations, but at the same under MBS. But at the same time, MBS has also drawn a lot of flack for the Yemen war and also specifically the Khashoggi incident. So it's a bit of an irony that at the center of it is Mohammed bin Salman, who seems to have done certain things that have been appreciated in the West and other things that have not really been appreciated in the West. I just want to get your view on that before I go back to Dr. Ottaway and then close this program.
Well, to be very honest with you, I mean, the paradox that you talk about within the relationship has always been there. Personally, I've never seen a time or analysis regarding Saudi Arabia and the United States without this paradox. This paradox has always been there. And this is precisely part of the identity of this relationship. This is one of the characteristics of the relationship, that it's maintaining this paradox. Now, you could even see this, the United States probably does it in its own way, and I'll leave that to Dr. Ottaway. But for example, in Saudi Arabia, you see how Saudi Arabia, for example, manages its paradox, because also for Saudi Arabia, they also do see a paradox in the United States. Here's a country that's supposed to be protecting kind of its Arab allies, yet it supports historically, for example, Israel and kind of its stances regarding Iraq, etc. So this paradox that's being perceived is also perceived from the Saudi perspective.
Okay.
So we're seeing kind of a web of paradoxes.
That's an interesting and a fair point. I'm sorry, I have to sort of pace it up. But okay. Dr. Ottaway, you've written a book recently. I haven't read it as yet, but I'll certainly look for it. And Mohammed bin Salman. So give me your sense of how you look at this central figure in Saudi politics internally also, and in terms of Saudi relations with the external world, specifically with the United States, and the fact that, this point that Dr. Al-Ghashian has talked about, that the paradox works both ways.
Mohammed bin Salman started out here, like everybody was fascinated with him when he came here in April and May 2018. He did one hell of a job, salesman job. He's the only Saudi leader who actually sought out the media and the press and sat down for talks and met with the editorial boards of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, this was extraordinary. So there was an enormous fascination and this youthful Saudi who was coming onto the screen. And then what happened? 4 months later, or April to October, he goes and authorizes the cutting up of Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, which was a huge shock here. It just radically changed his image. And at least in the United States, everybody had been fascinated. He was not almost walking on water, as we say. And then he did this, and it was just a huge shock, and it was a great fall coming down for him in the United States in his image. And that's where the Icarus, and by the way, I put a question mark at the end of
that's right,
the Icarus of Saudi Arabia.
That's right.
Because maybe sometime he'll come back up. But so that's totally different than anything that's happened in our relationship before. We've never had an American.
But quickly, Dr. Ottaway, the thing is that it's also about realpolitik. I mean, the reason President Biden was there was, and I mean, as you said, he called him a pariah and the rest of it. But at the end of the day, it's about interstate relations. Now, Saudi Arabia, with what is known as the Davos in the desert, hundreds and thousands of corporate leaders are going to come there. So Saudi Arabia still retains a lot of heft in terms of reaching out to corporate entities within the US and elsewhere also. And I think that's something that's going to obviously be factored in by the US leaders. I mean, this particular incident notwithstanding. And I'm talking about the recent oil cuts.
Well, it isn't private business that ends up deciding what U.S. policy is going to be. And the headwinds against Mohammed bin Salman in the U.S. Congress are growing stronger and stronger.
Okay.
And I don't care whether, J.P. Morgan and Blackstone, et cetera. In fact, I think the Future Investment Initiative conference starts tomorrow, I think,
Yes.
in Riyadh.
Yeah.
And there are a number of American businessmen participating and even talking.
Correct.
But even as that's going on, the pressure in Congress for some kind of action against Saudi Arabia grows and grows and grows.
Right, and that's what President Biden has said, that he's going to take certain decisions after he is consulted with the Congress. But thank you so much, Dr. David Ottaway, Dr. Al-Ghashian, for your insights. This is all for today, and we shall be seeing you after a couple of weeks. Until then, stay safe.